Grace Kamweru is a landscape architect, environmental planner, and assistant lecturer at the Technical University of Kenya. In episode 4 of the Future Cities Africa series, focusing on urban governance and how to get it right in managing urban growth in towns and cities in Kenya, this episode will explore the climate and sustainability agenda for future cities. Grace, welcome. What is the status of climate change and associated crises in this post-pandemic era at a city level?
I'll start by attempting to answer this. Is that yes, climate change is here, but I'll start by saying that global and national and local economies are still on development paths that are dependent on fossil fuels and the finite natural resources that are continually harming the planetary and human health. And this is evidenced by the three mega crises of our time. So the climate change crisis, the biodiversity loss crisis, and the waste and pollution crisis. So as a result of this crisis in 2020, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, you reckon that nature revealed a myriad of consequences with various parts of the world experiencing droughts, wildfires, floods, and even here in East Africa, we experience the locust swarms. So cities and the urban countrysides or the peri-urban centers surrounding cities. So in this case, like Nairobi, we have peri-urban centers around Nairobi, like in Kiambu or in Rongai, where these are the places where many of these trends converge, since the urban environment amplifies these challenges. So this is attributed by the growing population, which is largely concentrated in cities, along with the increase in resource consumption and production. So to sustain the needs of the people now living in the cities, we find that it accounts for like 90% of global biodiversity loss, 90% of water stress, and 54% of global greenhouse gases.
How has the pandemic affected the progress and the transition towards the Sustainable Development Goals? And what is the impact of climate action plans in Kenya? And are there any possible key successes to date?
The pandemic was at the height in the year 2020. And since the world met together, the countries of the world met together in 2015 in Paris, and they launched the Transforming the World, the 2030 agenda. We found that there was some progress to start with. But with the pandemic happening, we saw that years and even decades of progress have been halted, and even in some cases, the progress has been reversed. So in the pandemic year, that is 2020, we found that global extreme poverty, the rate rose for the very first time in 20 years. So hundreds of millions of people were pushed back into extreme poverty and chronic hunger. You reckon with the pandemic, it's obvious that the health sector was the one that was most affected. I mean, we saw millions of people losing their lives, losing their livelihoods, and even today, we still find millions of people grappling with the virus, despite the advances with the vaccine. And also, life expectancy has been shortened in some regions. Now, the education sector, I think, was another sector that was really disrupted. We saw that learning was disrupted across the world in the times of forced lockdowns, where schools and universities were forced to close down. So that means in this year, 2021, we find that school calendars have really been affected, where learning is continuous. There are really no breaks for students between semesters or terms. I think the other sector that was affected was gender equality. You know, with the forced lockdowns and families coming together and staying at home most of the times, we find that women who are the primary caregivers, they were forced to have their kind of work increased at home, which is essentially unpaid work. We also saw major losses for manufacturing industries, where, for instance, like here in Africa, we see that industries they are labor intensive. We also saw industries like the aviation. I mean, air travel was really disrupted when countries closed down their borders. So because of the lockdowns, they could not operate. And this also led to the companies laying off employees, which also affected incomes for many families. And then also the pandemic has also brought in and exposed and even intensified inequalities within and among countries. So we see power asymmetry. So the gap between the rich and the poor continues to increase. And definitely the poor are really affected because the pandemic makes their situations more vulnerable. So there are so many areas that I think were affected, but to me, these were the main sectors that really suffered during the pandemic. On what Kenya is doing in terms of climate action, I would say that the Climate Change Act of 2016 is the main legislation that is guiding Kenya's climate change response. So it helps it is the legal foundation for the National Climate Change Action Plan. So it's the action plan is often allocated 5 years. So the current Climate Change Action Plan runs between 2018 and 2022. So the Climate Change Act, which was effected by Parliament back in 2016, it provides that regulatory framework for enhanced response to climate change. So it basically addresses the options for low carbon, climate resilient development for Kenya. It helps Kenya to adapt to climate impacts and mitigate the growing emissions. Now, it's obvious that, and it's already apparent that Kenyans are already feeling the impacts of climate change. I mean, with higher temperatures in dry seasons, unpredictable rainfall patterns, increased incidence of droughts and floods, and the rising sea levels. And all these are impacting people across the country. So these extreme weather events have led to loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, reduced crop and livestock production. And this ultimately leads to food insecurity in the country and damage of infrastructure. But with the existence of the Climate Change Action Plan, I think we stand a chance to try and deal with climate change. So I don't have really tangible evidence of how the successes of the plan, but I would try to point out that Kenya, being a signatory of the United Nations and having taken part in the Paris Agreement, we are online to provide adaptation and mitigation measures on how to reduce the greenhouse gases by 30% by the year 2030. I think that's one possible success we have attained so far. At the national level, we have all these regulatory frameworks in forms of laws, policies, plans, and institutions that are all geared to address climate change. And the foundation of all this is in the Constitution of Kenya. So, and then in Kenya, we have devolved government with 47 county governments, and they're already in progress of setting aside funds for climate action. I think that's another possible success when developing their annual budget. And lastly, the Climate Change Action Plan works in tandem with the Big Four agenda, which is the current government's blueprint towards achieving the Vision 2030. So it has priority areas in food security, affordable housing, manufacturing, and affordable healthcare.
How is the growth by gross domestic product or GDP no longer sustainable for countries?
I'll start by giving a brief history. About 50 years ago, a team of 30 think tanks, they were like different scientists from 10 different countries across the world. They met in Rome. So they were dubbed the Club of Rome. So they met to discuss the trends of the world back then. That was back in 1968. So they were discussing about the exponential growth of population, industrialization, pollution, agricultural production, and the resource depletion. So in in 1972, their report, The Limits to Growth, was published, and it gave insight into how unsustainable that kind of growth is in a planet that is marked by finite resources. So nonetheless, the gross domestic product, what you call the GDP, it remains the supreme indicator of any country's economic strength up to date. So we find that cities alone account for like 85% of global GDP. And despite that report on limits to growth, we find that today, 50 years later, is that we have doubled our population, we have doubled our global GDP, the gross GDP, and we have tripled material consumption, our material consumption, and that's alarming. So that's according to World Bank interactive data of 2020. So this pursuit for more growth by GDP is deeply embedded in the linear economic model of take, make, use, and waste. So what is happening is that we are taking pristine resources in a faster rate than they can replenish themselves, making products, using them, and throwing them away after single use. So leading to the entire waste crisis that we have in global cities. So this kind of growth, linear growth, has come under scrutiny by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, who warned that the world faces severe, pervasive, and irreversible damages due to the rising of greenhouse gases emissions out of the kind of production that we have in place today. So the latest IPCC report of August 2021 was actually dubbed the Code Red for Humanity by the United Nations, and it highlights those extremes of climate change and the associated effects. And this is because of as a result of our indiscriminate consumption and production patterns. So to try and show the linkage between this resource use and the problems of meeting our needs, sort of digress into the new science. And we cannot, maybe I can reflect back by using the donut economic model by economist Kate Raworth, where she has developed this simple compass showing an inner ring that just basically shows the social foundations or the needs of the people, and an outer ring of showing the 9 planetary boundaries, which I'll be explaining shortly, and the middle ring, which she calls them the sweet spot for humanity, or what I would call the sustainable development. It shows that kind of relationship where, indeed, for us to attain sustainable development, it means we can do so by meeting all the needs of the people. So not having a shortfall in the social foundation of the people, but doing so in a way that we do not transgress the life supporting systems that are depicted within the 9 planetary boundaries. So when you talk about the social foundation, we are basically talking about what we need as humans. What are our social aspirations? We need water, we need food, health, education, decent income, peace and justice, political voice, social equity, gender equality, housing, networking, and energy. And everybody needs that in the world. So you find that there's a bit of disparity, because you find that countries in the more affluent countries are able to meet all these needs. And the less affluent countries have shortfalls in meeting that. But the disparity comes in that as the more affluent countries are able to meet the social foundation, they are doing so while transgressing the 9 planetary boundaries. So currently, we have already surpassed 4. So just to, for those who've not come across this, is that these boundaries, we are talking about climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, freshwater withdrawals, land conversion, biodiversity loss, air pollution, and ozone layer depletion. So when you say we have transgressed 4, currently we have transgressed on climate change, biodiversity loss, land conversion, and the nitrogen and phosphorus loading. So you find that there is danger in that, because we are living in a society that is highly consumptive. You reckon that we are living in the era of social media and advertising, and we are seeking lifestyles that seek for bigger things, faster things, more things. And these kind of lifestyles, really, to meet these needs of the people currently, we are gradually transgressing these life-supporting systems of the planet. And all this is destabilizing sustainable development. Thank you.
Grace, you've hinted at the circular economy. Is this the opportunity of our time for completing the picture in addressing climate change, besides shifting to renewable energy?
Yes, indeed. I concur that indeed circular economy is the world's largest opportunity of our time to address climate change. And this is actually affirmed by architect William McDonough, who happens to be the pioneer of the cradle to cradle concept. So this statement has also been compounded widely. We can see, like, for instance, from the Circularity Gap report of 2021 by Circle Economy, and also statements by the United Nations Environment Program Director, that is Inga Anderson, that the world is only 8% circular. So that means we have a 92% chance to shift, to transit to a better way of doing things, different from the business as usual, which has really proven that it is no longer sustainable. So to achieve the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees, countries have agreed to decarbonize their energy systems. Now, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been at the forefront to promote the circular economy ideology at the global platform. We saw that they made a lot of contributions at the just concluded COP26, the World Leaders Summit at Glasgow. And they are basically trying to prove how circular economy completes that picture of achieving the Paris Agreement target, where half the effort is can be attained using renewable energy, and the other half is by transitioning to circular economy. And maybe for those who've not come across this concept, to try and understand how this can happen, is that circular economy is a concept that rides on three principles, which involve, like, moving to a system that designs out waste and pollution, keeps products and materials in use. So we keep using materials over and over again and leverage their use. So that means treating waste at the end of their life cycle as fresh resource or fresh feedstock for new processes. And then the last principle is to regenerate natural systems. So the circular economy, I believe, is it's like sort of like a business logic that describes practical and scalable opportunities for all actors. When you talk about actors, you're talking about government, we're talking about the public because they are the main consumers. We are targeting industries because they are the ones that produce products, so there's a stake for everyone, and education also. And this is made possible by moving towards adopting new models and new policies for an economy that is by design regenerative and as waste-free as possible. So it presents that alternative development path that solves the world resource use problem that we desperately need today. So it's sort of like a shift from the linear economy, which is very wasteful, and it tries to tackle even issues of planned obsolescence, because we have seen that companies are making products that are not durable. So that's kind of making obsolete products where makes consumers to keep on buying over and over again. So I think circular economy is that ultimate opportunity to try and solve all these crises we are grappling with and ultimately solve the issue of climate change.
On the water crisis in Nairobi, what is the role of water urbanism in addressing climate change in cities and the urban countrysides?
So indeed, in Nairobi, water is a dissipating resource. We find that the city is particularly under a major water crisis that is marked by water scarcity and contamination in some of its water sources. So, like you can see, Nairobi River is pretty much polluted downstream because of the kind of activities that take place upstream and also within the city. So statistics show that there's a 25% shortfall of water supply in Nairobi, and an even more lamentable situation where only half of the 6 million Nairobi residents have access to piped water. So that means that the other half are forced to depend and rely on water kiosks, boreholes, water tankers, and even purchasing from water vendors who use, like, the hand-drawn carts. So this problem is even more magnified in informal settlements, where we find that there's a dire water shortage in the slums. So we find that only like a fifth of the informal settlement dwellers have access to piped water. Now, on the same issue of water is that this water crisis, it has a very close nexus with the prevailing COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see that water-related afflictions have been compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, where water is playing a prominent role to forestall the imminent danger of the virus. I mean, with the advocacy by the government seeking for citizens to practice hand washing. So this kind of practice is being frustrated by the biting water crisis in the city. Now, having noted this problem, is that I believe that water and forest urbanism in the context of built environment has a potential to address these problems, to address climate change, to address issues of water pollution and all these problems within the water sector. So water and forest resources in cities like Nairobi, which is expanding very fast, and especially on the hinterland, so the countrysides or the peri-urban areas that surround the city. So they can play a crucial role to spread urbanity. So we have to rethink alternative water and forest management techniques, and this can help to address issues of pollution, deforestation, agricultural and poor agricultural techniques that lead ultimately to contamination of the water. So to achieve this, we can attempt to lobby for like scalable water sensitive adaptations from the household level to neighborhood level, at the city scale, and even at the territorial scale. So here we are looking at interventions such as rainwater harvesting, use of like communal reservoirs to reduce groundwater extraction, because like in Nairobi, you find that so many people dig boreholes. So that also destabilizes groundwater reserves. And then techniques such as drip irrigation, so in farms or orchards within the this rural metropolis surrounding the cities. So that helps to also conserve the amount of water. In terms of dealing with water pollution, so we can look at regenerative designs like use of constructed wetlands to try and polish this wastewater before it gets to the water sources. So that would come in very handy, especially for industries that often discharge their post-industrial effluents into the rivers. So this would come in really handy. And dealing with these problems also means with dealing with the issues upstream. So it's and sort of like looking at water management at the territorial level. So we look at the entire watershed. So also improving agriculture upstream, meaning like use of nature-based solutions, use of natural fertilizers. At the city level, we also have issues of stormwater management. Like in Nairobi today, after short downpours, we find that part of the city is flooding. So if we can look at adaptations such as use of permeable paving, use of like incorporating rain gardens in the open spaces within the city, bioswales, all this can assist in stormwater management and to help reduce flooding and to help in recharge of groundwater reserves. So we have seen cities in other places in the world where they actually go a step further of transforming these spaces, which, well, on one side, they're dealing with that scientific function of stormwater management, but at the same time, they are used as dual spaces to also meet recreational needs of the people. So you find like constructed wetlands are made into parks, and they can bring in people for user experience, for recreation, for research, So all these things are things that we can try to look at.
How can cities achieve sustainable settlements through the provision of affordable housing to all socio-economic groups in the city?
The rapid rate of population growth in Nairobi City has resulted to increased demand for housing and related infrastructure, which outpaces the supply. So this leads to proliferation of slums marked by insufficient basic services for the lower income groups. And the same problems also affects the wealthy citizens. So here, the other side is that the wealthy city dwellers, they also face debt and sustainability. This is through the hefty mortgages that they ascribe to be able to provide also housing for them through the new capitalistic growth of new towns and gated communities, especially in the urban countrysides of the city where they prefer to stay. So provision of affordable and adequate housing for all these different kinds of socioeconomic groups is actually a problem. And this is further escalated by more challenges. Say, for instance, there's high cost of land and high cost of building materials. There's also poor governance and corruption in the housing sector, conflicting cultural interests. We have issues of like tenure insecurity. And in cases of like slum upgrading projects, we've seen challenges of like long implementation time of these housing projects, which pave way for loss of funds, which are meant for slum eradication and provision of affordable housing to the lower income groups. So the other problem that we can't ignore is the problem of waste management, which I have covered in the above discourse. So there's a lot of poor waste management within the housing sector, and this is because there is low investments in waste infrastructure. We do not segregate our waste at the source, which makes recovery and recycling quite difficult and unsafe and costly and also very ineffective. Now, to try and explain how this transition to circular housing strategy as a solution to all these problems, how it can help to bring about ecologically safe and socially just future in our cities, is that circular housing strategy presents a framework for tackling all these challenges. So it does so by it is linked with the ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals to meet the social aspirations of the people. So pretty much the social needs of the people. So housing helps to eradicate poverty. It helps to improve health, creation of employment, reduced inequality, and creation of sustainable settlements. Now, integrating green building practices, this is in architecture and related disciplines, is that and also incorporation of green spaces. So this one is like leveraging the strategies by like landscape architecture. All these, they help to offer ecological support to the environment, and this can be done so through like carbon. When you have more green spaces, we are able to sequestrate carbon. We're able to also incorporate strategies like renewable energy use. We are also, when you create green spaces, we are also creating new habitats for biodiversity. We are also able to reduce air and water pollution and reduce waste generation, and ultimately also reduce land conversion. Now, the housing sector also involves extraction of lots of natural materials. You reckon that we use materials such as timber, stones, water, sand, and like in my previous explanation of how this over extraction of these natural resources is really alarming, because we are not giving them time to replenish themselves. So this kind of extractions, we can try and rethink how we can replace that. Let's say we can involve this practice can be in tandem with like afforestation practices to help in replacing the trees that are being cut down for timber. We can also embrace new technologies to try and avoid over-reliance on these limited resources. Let's say there are new technologies in architecture, like 3D printing in architecture, which many high-end architects at the global platform are already looking at the potential for the same. So this helps to reduce the material footprint on relying on the natural materials which are finite in nature. Then to try and make the housing sector more socially just is that the sector is labor intensive, you reckon? So labor procurement and supply chain services should also be circular to ensure there is fair pay to consultants. We find that sometimes the price given for design fees, let's say by architects, landscape architects, by planners, by engineers, we find that it's highly contested, because some developers feel that they shouldn't pay for the amount of professional fees that is demanded by these consultants, but it's pretty much what is needed. So there needs to be like fair pay to the consultants. There need to be fair pay to the laborers. They also need to be fair pay to the transporters, because also the housing sector is also transport intensive. So and all these kind of strategies will help in creating healthy, peaceful, and socially just environments.
Grace, finally, what are the main challenges to addressing climate change?
To try and answer this, because it's pretty much a complex question, is that I'll try to couple challenges and barriers to try and address climate change, because that's a question everybody wants to know. So I'll just attempt in my own view. And I'll also try to couple drivers and enablers, sort of like what are those possible solutions that we can embrace in trying to address climate change. So for the challenges is that it becomes difficult, especially in the low-income countries, for them to address climate change because of issues to do with finances. So you reckon from the COP26 discourse, there was all this discussion and, and debates between the less affluent countries and the island countries trying to contest why the countries that are more developed, the G7 countries, the G20 countries, that are essentially the higher or the greater emitters of like greenhouse gases, and therefore there is this finance that they're supposed to finance the low-income countries, because what happens is that the less emitters end up being to end up feeling the greater effects of climate change. So finance is very crucial. So if finance is availed, I think that would go a long way in to try and have this climate change mitigation measures. And then also on the part of the public, I mentioned that there is this zestful consumption patterns between the among the people. So that calls for that becomes a challenge, because in a society which is highly consumptive, that to meet their needs calls for over extraction of materials and resources, then that becomes unsustainable. So that becomes a challenge, the kind of consumption patterns we have today. And the other challenge or barrier towards addressing climate change is that, especially in cities in Africa, we have less innovations and less technology to try and deal with the issues of climate change, which becomes a challenge. There are cases where in more developed countries, they're already using technology. I mean, we're in the age of Internet of Things, on the big data analytics, where countries are using technologies to, for instance, in like the waste sector. So we find like countries like Korea, they're able to use like eco labels. Countries, I think it's in South Africa, where they use some mobile technologies to try and trace consumers. There is even a company called El Gramo from Chile. They are able also to have these like refill programs where they code products. So that means that it becomes very easy for them to trace the products, and it becomes also very easy for them to trace their consumers from the mobile technology. So we lack this kind of innovation. So if we had this kind of more innovations and greater technology, I think would go a long way to try and address climate change. The other challenge could be lack of infrastructure, still on the waste sector, because that's a sector that is that I'm very passionate about, is that we lack infrastructure. During my postgraduate stay at KU Leuven, I remember in Belgium, I remember we used to have these coded collection bags for waste. So like green for organic waste, blue for plastic waste, brown for inorganic waste, and then the city had designated points where we would go and dump like glass waste. So this kind of infrastructure becomes it becomes very easy for the public to adopt. So, but in our case, like here in Nairobi, where we do not sort our waste right from the source, it becomes very difficult. So lack of infrastructure becomes a huge challenge and a barrier towards shifting to more sustainable and more, innovative ways of addressing climate change. So that is a very prominent barrier. So infrastructure is very important. Now, to try and brainstorm like different drivers and enablers that can help us to address climate change. I would look at this in terms of what can different actors do. So what can government do? What can the public do? What can producers and companies do? What can civil society do? And what can education institutions do? So to start with, like government can provide incentives in such a manner that for those organizations or companies that are already uh, doing climate sensitive ventures, government can offer incentives like zero taxing to such companies. So that would go a long way to encourage more and more innovations that are climate sensitive. Um, uh, Technology is very vital. So I think that also is a responsibility of the government. If they can help people to adopt these new technologies and maybe try to finance these technologies and also provide the right kind of infrastructure, I think that would go a long way to try and address climate change. Um, as a person and a professional and as an assistant lecturer at a local university, so I still feel that academia has a huge stake in trying to address climate change. So education and awareness. So this means that by educating more people about the effects of climate change, the effect of these patterns that we see of consumption and production, and what can be done at all levels, I think it will help to create future change makers who will bring a great impact towards addressing climate change, not just now, but also in the future. There's also the aspect of planning and finance. Like I mentioned, that for all great innovations that are trying to address climate change, finance is needed. And therefore, if we can have more donors, more NGOs, even at the international level, that direct their finances towards climate action, I think that would go a long way to addressing climate change. The other aspect would be, like I mentioned, yes, especially in here in Africa, even here in Kenya, we have all these frameworks in place. We have legislation, we have laws and policies, we have institutions, and all these have very clear mandates. They are very ambitious. They already, it's very clear. They denote how they can address climate change, but that's at a theoretical level. So I find that the challenge with our institutions is that there is this silo mentality. So you find that institutions work in solitude. So even if they are making efforts, the efforts are incremental. You find the gains are incremental. The gains are short-lived. The gains are only felt in different parts of the city. So I think one way of institutions can amend is by collaborating so that efforts and policies and actions are harmonized, like systems thinking, so that this issue of climate change is dealt with by all actors in that closed loop, in that, when we collaborate, it means the kind of solutions that will be effected will be felt across board. And then the aspect of monitoring and evaluation would also come in handy to try and address climate change, because when you monitor, you're able to know where the shortfalls are, where the drawbacks are, and you're able to know where more resources are needed. And then also there needs to be more investment in research. This can be done through capacity building. So if people in government, places of influence, or they can hold like workshops, they can hold more seminars, even at a global scale, to try and exchange ideas so that the issue of climate change is addressed by everyone at competent levels. And then the challenge for the public, pretty much everybody, is that there needs to be a shift in our behavior. So if there was individual and collective action from all individuals, this would go a long way in addressing climate change. So that would be my take.